coronavirus panic buying. The Metro's headline is Don't Be So Shelfish. See what they've done there. Tonight we're joined by the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. Do stay with us. As they arrive. In the next half hour we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Financial Times leads with the rapidly escalating coronavirus crisis in Italy, with more than 100 deaths and around 1,500 new cases confirmed there in a 24-hour period. The Telegraph reveals that despite the lockdown in Italy, dozens of flights have landed from hotspots, including Milan, with no checks. Italy in chaos as thousands race to escape quarantine, writes The Guardian, as the whole of Lombardy region will be on lockdown. The Times leads with the coronavirus story in Italy as well, as 16 million are in lockdown and the death toll soars to 366. And no-go zone, northern Italy in lockdown, says The Eye. Closer to home, the Metro cautions its readers not to engage in panic buying in response to the outbreak. The Express also focuses on those panic buying and says selfish shoppers are urged to stop panic buying. On the coronavirus fears, the Daily Mirror shows a picture of empty shelves, writing, "Now it's rationing." And a third virus victim in the UK. That's the headline for the Daily Mail, as they report on the latest fatality of COVID-19. Well, tonight we're joined by Christina Patterson and Benedict Spence. Welcome to you both. Starting, obviously, with coronavirus. It is the lead story and the one story. The Guardian, talking about the chaos, Italy in chaos as thousands race to escape quarantine. Why are they describing this chaos?
Well, because the Italian president has announced that 16 million people are going to be essentially quarantined in Italy, in the Lombardy region of northern Italy. And but that hasn't yet been put into practice. So people are basically kind of leaping on trains, into cars. It's a mass exodus. And it is chaos. And one quote leapt out at me, which is the president of Puglia, which is in the south of Italy, has said, "Do not bring the epidemic to Puglia. You are carrying the virus into the lungs of your parents." And I think that's the truth of it. And I mean, this time last week I was talking with my fellow guest, and he was saying, you know, oh, there's a lot of fuss about nothing. And I have to say, in the past week, I've been increasingly irritated and upset by people who said, oh, I think we're panicking too much. If you are young and healthy, that's lovely for you. But in fact, as we've heard today, a man in his 60s has died today. So you don't have to be that old to be vulnerable. And people with
he did have underlying health
He
problems.
did, and many of us do have underlying health conditions. But the point is that people are speaking as if older people over the age of 80, or indeed over the age of 60, are somehow worth less than younger people. And I really worry when people talk about the blitz spirit, and there seems to be a lot of confidence that people are going to behave well in these circumstances. A lot of people are already apparently behaving very selfishly, and it's not about whether you're going to get ill, it's about whether you're going to infect people who are vulnerable. And that's the terrifying thing about this whole pandemic.
I think you're completely right. I think this is something that often, we often talk about how the elderly in our society are very much sort of left behind by, sort of a generation that everything has to be very youth-focused and very, driven by progress, and that we have a generation of older people who are increasingly lonely and very isolated and left behind. But ultimately, this is a disease that it's claiming approximately 3% of people that it infects, but it does disproportionately affect the elderly and those with underlying health conditions. And this is something that those of us who are younger, fitter, healthier do need to bear in mind. That ultimately, it's not simply a question of not going out and mingling with our friends. It's about specifically who it is that's more at risk from this disease. Now, some things need to be taken into account. For example, between the differences between us and Italy. Italy is a culture that, shall we say, sets a little bit more store by its elderly people. You don't have quite the same problems with isolation amongst elderly people. They're much more involved in the communities and much more involved in family life. So you can understand why the north of Italy would go to such extreme lengths of shutting down so many people, because it would be perfectly commonplace to be intermingling young people who have been traveling abroad, perhaps, with older people, a lot more than it would, say, happen in this country. So perhaps that goes some way to explaining why
And they have
it is
a higher
exploded.
elderly population
They
as
also,
well.
yes, exactly. So perhaps that gives you some idea as to why it has expanded quite so quickly, and why it might not happen on the same scale in this country, or hasn't happened yet on that scale in this country. But that's not to say that the human cost of this, for everybody that says, oh, well, we don't need it. No, I myself, at the start of it, when it was still confined to China, said, well, I'm not too concerned about it yet. But ultimately, one does have to think more in terms of society at large and who it is going to focus. And you do need to think very carefully about specifically the type of people that are going to suffer. And from that purpose, it makes a lot of sense why the president of Puglia said specifically, don't come back to visit your family. People who have moved to the north, the industrial epicenter of Italy, don't come back to visit your elderly parents, because you're not necessarily doing a lot of good if you do that. So I think that's why we see
Actually,
where
I
we
think
are.
he's talking about people coming back who live in the south but who were maybe on holiday in the north.
Also that, yes.
Let's take a look at the Telegraph, and they're talking about a quarantine fast because Italian planes are flying
Yeah.
into this country without any checks.
I saw that
Which
on
is
Twitter today.
so
And you think,
surprising.
so far, Boris Johnson, bless his cotton socks, which is not something I say very often, but has been trying to look as though he's listening to experts, which has made a nice change after the last few years. And Chris Whitty has been superb in presenting, the chief medical officer, in presenting measured, calm, scientific, evidence-based advice. However, all those reassurances are worth nothing if on the ground we're not taking, or the government is not taking, very basic measures it should be taking. Clearly, if the whole of northern Italy is in lockdown, then people who are coming off planes from Milan to British airports should at least be having their temperature taken, or at least there should be a sign of the protocol.
Do we presume then that hasn't been the medical advice?
That they shouldn't. Well, that's an interesting point. If it isn't the medical advice, it would seem helpful to explain why not. Because if countries are behaving so very differently, if the whole of northern Italy is, if the rest of Italy is protecting itself from anyone in northern Italy, but nobody's protecting 66 million British people from people who just come from northern Italy, that seems rather strange.
The only thing that I would raise, and I haven't seen anything on this, is how much warning did the Italian government give to neighbouring governments, give to other European countries and other countries that there are lots of direct flights, that they were about to take this measure? Because it has been in the past 24 to 48 hours that the number of Italian cases, it has skyrocketed by about 50%. That's a significant increase. So it is entirely possible that our authorities, they should perhaps have been a little bit more aware, but it is entirely possible that they were caught ever so slightly off guard, because a lot of these people were already in the air when the decision was made to quarantine this many people. So perhaps you can give them a little bit of leeway, but one would hope that there were contingency plans in place, and that we were perhaps starting to be a little more cautious, especially with countries like Italy where there is already an outbreak, to just be screening people a little bit better.
But I think the government advice has been for a while that if you're coming from northern Italy and you have symptoms, you should self-isolate, to use the phrase. But clearly, people on those planes were told nothing, and they were given no information when they arrived, and I think that's very alarming.
It does seem quite alarming. Let's turn to the Express. We spoke a little bit about whether people had common decency and would pull together and have the spirit of the Blitz, but seemingly not, because toilet rolls flying off the shelves, non-perishables, tinned food, pasta.
The important thing to remember in all of this is that actually shortages are going to be created by this kind of panic, by people actually cleaning shops out. Because let's be clear, on all of the things that they're currently talking about, there may need to be rationing. Toilet roll being particularly iconic, lavatory paper. There isn't a shortage of this. Nobody has ceased production of it. In China, anywhere else, even the countries that are most affected by this, production of these goods has not gone down. What is causing shortages is people panic buying and stocking up. And we go back to what we were saying at the start. Who are going to be the people who are most affected by this outbreak? They're going to be the elderly, and they're going to be the infirm. who therefore are going to be most vulnerable to to shortages like this? It's going to be that exact same demographic who perhaps also, we have to bear in mind, a less wealthy demographic of people who perhaps can't afford to go out and stockpile on a couple of months worth of goods. It's really, honestly, I would say this to anybody who was thinking about stockpiling. Please don't. If you're worried about shortages of supplies, or if you're worried about going out and contracting the virus in the supermarkets, I'm sure that there are better ways, perhaps staggering the amount of people that can come into a shop at a time, rather than going in and grabbing everything for yourself, because you are only making things worse for everybody else, and you yourself are causing the shortage.
Yes, creating the crisis. And just let's have a quick look at the Mail and their headline about the third victim, sadly, in this country.
Well, it's just, the awful thing is that every day now, for a long time, I'm afraid, we are going to be hearing news like this. And the even more awful thing may be that this starts disappearing off the front page, because it won't be one person died today. It will be a lot more than one person died today. And I think that government, the worst case scenario they're talking about is 500,000 deaths. I think I read today that we are probably looking at some of the kind of more realistic estimates are, could be 100,000. That's a lot of people dying. That's a lot of funerals. That's a lot of cremations. How are we going to manage the funerals? How are local authorities going to manage? Anyone who's had to deal with a death in the family, as I have recently, it's incredibly traumatic. And we may even be in a situation where people are encouraged not to go to funerals because of spread of contagion.
Christina and Benedict, we're going to leave it there to take a break, but we shall be back for more. Don't forget, we'll have full coverage on COVID-19 and what is happening in the UK tomorrow morning, including a government meeting with sports governing bodies and broadcasters to discuss how to deal with the outbreak's possible impact on the sporting calendar. Kay Burley will be joined in the studio by Oliver Dowdall, the Secretary of State for Digital Media, Culture and Sport. That's Kay Burley at breakfast, live from Westminster from 7 o'clock. Coming up here, though, on the press preview, we'll look ahead to Rishi Sunak's first budget as Chancellor. Join us after the break. Benedict Spence, and we're going to take a look at The Guardian now, previewing the budget. Not been in the job very long. He's had an awful lot on his plate, hasn't he, Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think really his chances of doing anything that might be considered sort of radical in terms of what they want to do, their so-called levelling up agenda for the so-called red wall, voters who voted for them, or as Boris Johnson put it, lent them their vote. I think all of that's been blown out of the water by what's happened in the last 10 days. So I think the idea of, kind of Westminster insiders were going to be looking very closely at whether the Tories were going to stick to their manifesto promises of staying within the fiscal rules they'd set themselves. Clearly they're not. It's unlikely they will now, but they've got the perfect excuse, which is not to trivialise coronavirus, because the economic cost of this alone, let alone the cost to the NHS, is likely to be absolutely gargantuan. But I think it means that Rishi Sunak's chances of kind of putting his own personality and imprint on the thing in, as far as Dominic Cummings was ever going to let anyone do that, are now considerably reduced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's... perhaps wrong to say that he's got away with it a little bit, but I was ever so slightly concerned for his chances after Sajid Javid released what was going to be his budget, which went down incredibly well with a very large portion of the Tory electorate. This sort of radical free market idea of the future. Now, obviously, the coronavirus outbreak was always going to slightly, mean that wasn't entirely possible, even if Mr. Javid had remained Chancellor. But the problem with that was the second it came out, anything that Mr. Sunak did that was too closely aligned to that would have been seen as, that's Sajid Javid's budget that he's in from. And anything that he didn't, if it then went wrong, everybody would have gone back and said, well, if only Sajid Javid had done his budget. So I do think that it's a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not that one wants to think about people using a virus outbreak for political gain, but certainly it's come at an ever so slightly convenient time for a Chancellor and a Prime Minister's Chief Advisor who are under a little bit of mounting pressure after Mr. Javid's resignation, I think.
Although Rishi Sunak has said on record that he will be sticking to the manifesto pledges and hopefully staying within the constraints of what they had offered.
Well, everybody does until they don't. But one of the things that did strike me that was very interesting is this idea, and this is in the Telegraph, that they're going to invest $5 billion in very fast broadband, the latest broadband, which I suppose we could perhaps already do with that, seeing as we're all being told we're going to have to go into self-isolation. But if this is going to be the future of work, and lots of people are saying that companies are going to have to sort of readjust with that eye on the future about people having to perhaps quarantine and isolate themselves, that's going to be a vital part of investment if we are going to be able to exist in that kind of sphere.
Let's move on to the Mirror and Harry and Meghan's final farewell tour, their final engagements.
Well, I think this has been, I'm not a particularly royalist, but like every human being on the planet, I've been transfixed by this drama because these are now probably the most famous couple in the world at the moment. And I have felt very sad for everybody, actually, in this whole saga. I felt very sad for the Queen because she has given all these years of absolute, devoted, dutiful service, and she clearly adores Harry. And, Harry is a very lovable person as far as one can tell. And
it does seem to be quite a sad farewell for themselves. I mean, yesterday we reported that Harry himself seemed quite sad at the thought of leaving.
Yeah.
Christina and Benedict, for the moment, thank you very much. We shall see you in an hour's time.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the weather for you now.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, Monday may start on a largely dry and sunny note, but don't be fooled. Another spell of wet and windy weather will spread in from the west. Much of the UK and Ireland will have a chilly but bright morning with just a few showers around. However, thicker clouds. And Benedict Spence, welcome back to you both. Starting off with the Times and coronavirus, of course, but talking about the holiday chaos as Italy shuts down.
Absolutely. I suppose certainly for a country like Italy that is very sort of dependent on the tourism industry, this is going to be absolutely devastating. I mean, so when you take into account the fact that the northern part of Italy, the few provinces in the north, are some of the world's most economically prosperous areas in the world, it really does drive the country. And you consider then, therefore, that that's all been shut down, and on top of that, you're going to have all the revenue that have been brought from tourism from everywhere, from Milan to Venice has been shut down. Masses across Rome are no longer going to be said. This really is even though the outbreak has been limited so far to the north, it hasn't quite reached the south in the same way. It is going to be something that just has a dreadful economic knock-on for the rest of the country. And I mean, as we've already discussed, the fact that 16 million people are now under quarantine, I mean, that's a huge number. I mean, we've not even begun to thought of numbers like that in this country. But of course, the number of active cases, the number of fatalities has rocketed up in the last few days. So it makes a lot of sense for a country that has a very high burden in terms of an aging population. A large percentage of the country is elderly and therefore more at risk to the virus. And also, as a society, is a lot more sort of in tune with its elderly people. They play a much more sort of active role in the family, for example. It has a very different way of approaching things than we do here. So you can absolutely see how such a thing could spread very quickly and why they've had to take very drastic measures to prevent it from doing so.
Yeah, and I fear that this is a taste of what many countries will shortly be facing, probably, alas, including us. And we haven't lived through anything like this in our lifetimes. I mean, SARS was minuscule compared to this. And it's very, very frightening. And it's frightening for everybody, but it's frightening because it's clearly incredibly contagious. I mean, as we're seeing, some of the cases in this country are from in people who haven't travelled to areas which are currently have high levels of contagion. But the terrifying thing is that there are groups that are particularly vulnerable, and for people over 80, the estimates of mortality rates are between 15 and 20%. That's 1/5 of people. And one of the things that's so upsetting in this whole discussion really is how some people are saying, but most people aren't affected. It's not really the point that most people aren't affected. The point is that you affect somebody who is vulnerable. We could all affect somebody who's vulnerable. And I do think that this, I mean, apparently people from northern who have been either who are working, have been working in northern Italy or on holiday there. The president of Puglia has been saying to them, please be careful, please don't rush back, please don't breathe coronavirus into your parents' lungs. But I think a lot of people are thinking about themselves and whether they themselves are going to be infected, and that really isn't the point.
Important to stress, though, that people do recover from COVID-19, and it isn't fatal in
some
every
people do.
every
Absolutely,
instance.
absolutely. But but
The current mortality rate is 3%. This is the awful thing. It doesn't sound like a very high amount, but it's the Stalin quote. One death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. We obviously we have to think about these things in terms of the broad picture, but you do also have to remember that your individual actions, even if it does just infect one person who has an underlying health condition or is elderly, these things do have very tragic consequences, and that needs to be borne in mind.
Let's move on to the Mail and their headline. They're referencing the very sad death of the third victim in the UK.
well, it's just desperately sad. This was someone who we don't know anything about him except that he had been to northern Italy, presumably on holiday.
He was over 60 and had underlying health
issues. But frankly, an awful lot of people do have underlying health issues, and particularly when you get to your 60s, many people are taking medication for one thing or another. I mean, I've had cancer a couple of times. My immune system, no doubt, isn't in the best shape, and I'm not 60, but we all know people who have underlying health conditions or who are over 60 who are therefore at greater risk. So this is for him and for his family and for all the people who loved him, it is nothing less than a tragedy. And that will be the case for every single death that happens in the next few months that would not have happened. And I'm afraid there are going to be an awful lot of them. The assessments are, worst case scenario could be 500,000, but we could well be looking at 100,000, 200,000. And then presumably those deaths won't even hit the front pages.
Well, that's the worst case scenario. I mean, that's projecting quite a way into the future, and we don't have the number of cases that they have in this.
500,000 is worst case scenario. 100,000 is not worst case scenario.
It is important to say, of course, that this is a situation that we, as a global community, let alone just the society, hasn't undergone for the best part of a century. The previous major pandemic, of course, being the Spanish flu. But we do live in incredibly interconnected times. So this, again, not wanting to sort of take the human element out of this, but how we react to this pandemic and how different countries react, we will have to use that going forward as the blueprint for actually how we deal with all kinds of outbreaks in the future, because in many ways actually it's a miracle that we haven't had something on this scale up until now, given actually, as we're seeing, how interconnected and how difficult it is to keep a track of this thing. In many ways it is, as you say, things like SARS were slightly more difficult to transmit, and Ebola difficult to pass between people, but actually it is in a lot of ways quite surprising that it's taken this long for something like this to happen.
The Metro suggesting that we're not dealing with it very well. People rushing out, panic buying.
Yes, absolutely.
I must say, I mean, on the one hand, government have told people to be prepared to self-isolate. So it is not crazy to make sure you've got a few tins and a couple of packets of pasta at home to get through your 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. But to be buying up the whole shelves is selfish, and it does mean that people who are likely to be more vulnerable and less able to get to the shops, they're going to have likely to have more trouble getting hold of food. But I also think this whole idea that we are blitz spirit, we get through things, we're all going to pull together, well, there isn't much evidence of that yet, and people are literally fighting over loo rolls at supermarkets, which is a very, very undignified and unnecessary response at this point. And it doesn't also, I'm afraid, build one's faith in people's ability to, for example, stay off work when they're going to lose money, which is a big thing to ask of people. I'm freelance, so if I self-isolate, I will also lose revenue, just as I do every time I get sick.
I mean, I've heard people on radio phone-ins saying that they will not self-isolate, having returned from regions that have been affected, because they stand to lose too much
For a
money.
lot of people,
Yeah.
it's actually not feasible, and you also have to think about people with families. How do you self-isolate if you've got a couple of children that you need to look after? It's actually
But
not
you
very
can
feasible.
not go into work.
Well, the thing to remember about the shortages and all of this is actually COVID-19 does not affect plants in the fields. It doesn't affect pigs or cows or anything like that. These things still continue to be, plants continue to be grown, animals continue to be farmed, and lavatory paper continues to be made. The shortage is not being created by the virus, it is being created by the fear and the reaction and the need to stockpile. Everybody needs to be very aware of this, that when you do stockpile like this, I understand it can be quite difficult, but we do live in an automated society where it's easier to deliver things. It's also easier to set up strategies where you can perhaps stagger the amount of people in a shop at any one time. You can check online to see how busy buildings are. This is within our remit
But it
to
does
do.
panic
So
people
actually, it
when
does,
they
but
see
people
empty
need to-
shelves.
which
So
is why
there might
they
not have been a
should
crisis
do
in
it.
the beginning.
There isn't,
But there is now.
There isn't a shortage of production.
No,
If
but
there's a shortage in the shops, it is because too many people are
But
buying
also,
things.
Benedict, we have to be able to trust that government are giving us accurate information. And on Question Time on Thursday night, Matt Hancock said, we are talking to the supermarkets. There will be no shortages. That turned out not to be true. A number of supermarket chiefs came out on Friday and said that's not true. Nobody's talked to us. And then a meeting was hastily convened. So we do need to be able to rely on the...
Well, the government is saying that they're talking to supermarkets.
They aren't now, but they could
hoping,
have,
hoping that they will be able to open for longer hours so they can have more deliveries. And
Stop stocking
Christina,
up on lavatory paper is what I'm saying.
yeah, we've got the message. Christina and Benedict, thanks very much for the moment. Don't forget, we'll have full coverage on COVID-19 and what is happening in the UK tomorrow morning, including a government meeting with sports governing bodies and broadcasters to discuss how to deal with the outbreak's possible impact on the sporting calendar. Kay Burley will be joined in the studio by Oliver Dowden, the Secretary of State for Digital Media, Culture and Sport. That's Kay Burley at Breakfast Live from Westminster from 7 o'clock. Coming up, he wasn't the Democratic nomination. He hasn't won it yet, but could Joe Biden already be sizing up a former rival to be his vice presidential running mate? That's next. Do stay with us. Preview with me this evening, Christina Patterson and Benedict Spence. We're going to take a look at the Times. It's a story that's covered also in the Telegraph, but this is President Erdogan telling Greece to open the border.
Yes, this is in the aftermath. Of course, there was an announcement a few days ago that there would be a ceasefire in northern Syria between Russian-backed forces and the Turkish armed incursion into the area. And one of the underlying stories behind all of this has been the steady mounting of Syrian migrants on the border with Greece, and they're being bussed there by the Turkish government, specifically to apply pressure on the EU and also on NATO to back Turkey in its fight with Russia and with the Assad regime. And this is just the latest stage, and that is that Turkey wants more reassurances, it wants more funding to actually keep a hold of the migrant community that is living in Turkey. There is a very large number of Syrian refugees, and it is expected, certainly if the ceasefire were to break down, which they have done in the past, and it's very likely that there would be an even larger exodus of up to 2 million people potentially leaving Idlib province and northern Syria. I think Mr. Erdogan has a point, frankly, that the West needs to be doing ever so slightly more in terms of helping out Turkey, and up to a point also for a while Lebanon as well took in an awful large number of Syrian refugees, and they've been left very much largely to their own devices. But this does remain a problem that is going to hit Europe, because you can look at this one of two ways. You can look at it as our NATO ally Turkey that we're not helping out, or you can look at it as the saber-rattling Turkey that is, a bit expansionist in the region, has been very aggressive, and is trying to shake us down for cash. Either way, there are human lives at stake that are just being sort of left out in the open in refugees camps, and they need to be dealt with one way or the other. They need to be housed, they need to be sheltered. Is that going to be in Europe? Because if Mr. Erdogan has his way, he will send them here either way. Is it going to be in Turkey, in which case we are going to have to fund that? That is a question that is going to rumble on throughout the summer, I suspect.
Well, it's going to rumble on beyond the summer, I think. I mean, this whole issue this tragedy of the war in Syria seems to go on forever and ever. But it also has to be said that they aren't all Syrian refugees. There are quite a lot. And when you look at the photos, which are desperately sad, the vast majority are young men. They are able-bodied young men from Iran, from Afghanistan, from a number of different, and in fact more widely than that. And I went to the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan and spent 2 days talking to Syrian refugees who are people like us, many of them from perfectly comfortable middle-class backgrounds. Syria used to spend more on a higher percentage of its GDP on education than we do. And this country has been blown apart, and now there are all these people who are homeless, rootless, and have nowhere to go. I think that the trouble here is, I mean, there isn't an answer to it because nobody seems to know how to solve the problem of the war in Syria, and tragically, Assad seems to be winning. But the broader problem of migration from horrible countries or war-torn countries or just poor countries to the EU will run and run, and nobody has a solution
It will
for it.
continue. But obviously, in this case, people particularly objecting to the fact that they're part of a game and they're being used as pawns, which they know.
Dreadful.
They know. We've just got
It must
time
be
to
said very quickly that this is ultimately what happens when the West steps back and doesn't take responsibility in these situations. I know everybody looks back to Afghanistan and Iraq and the disasters that happened afterwards, but look at the alternative. When the West doesn't step into places like Syria to at least try, then the vacuum is filled by countries like Iran, like Russia, and like Turkey, and this is the situation.
Let's just quickly get the times in on, we'll take you to America and possible running mate for Joe Biden.
Well, I think that's kind of stretching it, actually. The headline doesn't really correspond with the story on this. The story is that Kamala Harris has decided to throw her weight behind Joe Biden, which nearly all the other Democratic candidates are now doing. He's had a remarkable comeback.
Yes.
Whether he can beat Bernie Sanders, the nomination remains to be seen, and whether either of them have a hope in hell of beating Donald Trump really remains to be seen.
We shall
Donald
see.
Trump will be
Christina
president
and
for 4 years,
Benedict.
I'm afraid.
We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for taking us through the papers this
Thank
evening.
you.
Let's take a look at the weather for you now.